The behavioral biases of individuals. Most of what we discuss in the CFA program curriculum is based on traditional finance. Traditional finance assumes that individuals act rationally by considering all available information in their decision-making process, and this leads to optimal outcomes and efficient markets. So that is the basis of traditional finance. But behavioral finance challenges these assumptions by incorporating research on how individuals and markets actually behave. Behavioral finance assumes that people act in a normal way rather than acting in a rational way. Behavioral finance recognizes that people have behavioral biases that impact financial decision making. Behavioral biases can cause decisions to be different from the rational decisions, which is what traditional finance assumes. So in this reading or in these set of lectures, you are going to get a sense for behavioral biases. The way this reading is organized is as follows. I have already given you the basic introduction. In section 2, we will talk about the high-level categorization of behavioral biases. Broadly speaking, there are two categories or two types of behavioral biases. We can have cognitive errors and emotional biases. Cognitive errors refer to errors that are related to the thought process, whereas emotional biases are obviously related to emotions. So we look at the different kinds of cognitive errors and then the different kinds of emotional biases. And for each of these, we will understand the consequences, how to detect them, and then we will look at how these biases can be overcome. And then in the final section, we'll talk about the influence of behavioral finance and specifically the influence of these different kinds of biases on market behavior. At a high level, we can say that behavioral biases can either be cognitive or emotional. Cognitive errors stem from statistical information processing or memory errors. They can be based on faulty reasoning, but these sorts of errors can be corrected through better information or better education. On the other hand, emotional biases are biases which are influenced by feelings and emotions. Here, people tend to be acting spontaneously. So rather than acting based on proper information and proper logic, if people are acting spontaneously, then those sorts of biases would fall under emotional biases. Given that these biases are driven by feelings and emotions, they are less easy to correct compared with cognitive errors. So we just mentioned that since cognitive errors have to do with either faulty reasoning or faulty processing of information, these sorts of errors are relatively easy to correct. And again, the emphasis is on relatively easy. All we are saying is that cognitive errors tend to be easier to correct compared with emotional biases. We've said that under behavioral biases, we have two broad categories. We can have emotional biases and cognitive errors. This section will focus on cognitive errors. Now, even under cognitive errors, there are two subcategories. One category is belief perseverance, and the other category is information processing. So as you can imagine, belief perseverance related biases are based on a preservation of beliefs. So here we have 5 different biases, and I'm going to simply summarize these biases so that you start remembering them. And then over the next few slides, we'll talk about each of these biases in more detail. So let's look at the 5 belief perseverance biases. First, we have the conservatism bias. This involves maintaining prior views by inadequately incorporating new information. So a conservative person is someone who sticks to old views, and that's what is happening over here. With conservatism bias, a person simply sticks to old views and doesn't incorporate new information. Then we have the confirmation bias. Here, a person will look for and notice what confirms his or her beliefs. So, again, you might see this quite often. People already have a certain belief, and then they will look for evidence that supports their belief or that confirms their belief. That is confirmation bias. Then we have representativeness bias. Here, a person would classify new information based on past experiences. Then we have the illusion of control bias. This is the false belief that we can influence or control outcomes. And the fifth and final type of belief perseverance bias is the hindsight bias, where we see past events as having been predictable. So these are the 5 belief perseverance biases, and you can remember this as follows. So just say this a few times. CC-RE. CC-RE. So CC-RE is basically the first letter for each of these biases. Conservatism, confirmation, representativeness, illusion of control, and hindsight. CC-RE. Then we have 4 information processing biases. Anchoring and adjustment bias. This involves the incorrect use of psychological heuristics. So heuristics are shortcut methods that allow us to easily reach a conclusion. If those shortcuts are being incorrectly used, then the bias is called an anchoring and adjustment bias. Mental accounting bias is where someone treats one sum of money different from another sum of money. A framing bias is where a person might answer a question differently based on how it is asked. And availability bias is where a heuristic approach is influenced by how easily an outcome comes to mind. Now, again, I will just help you memorize these. So to remember information processing biases, just say AMFA. So AMF. AMFA. So the first A stands for anchoring and adjustment. The next is for mental accounting, F for framing, and A for availability. So AMFA. Now don't worry if you don't immediately remember all this. We'll be going over each of these biases in more detail. Let us now talk about belief perseverance biases in a little more detail. Belief perseverance is the tendency to cling to one's previously held beliefs irrationally, and this is linked to cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort when new information conflicts with existing beliefs. In traditional finance, we say that when new information comes in, then we use Bayes' formula and update our probabilities based on this new information. But what behavioral finance tells us is that generally people are uncomfortable responding to new information, especially when this new information conflicts with existing beliefs. This obviously applies to all aspects of our lives, but since the CFA program curriculum is related to finance, here we will talk about finance-related applications. And in a finance sense, we can say that a given person might have grown up believing that a certain type of investment or a certain category of investments are suitable for him and his family. But if new information comes in, which clearly indicates that the types of investments that are better are somewhat different, then belief perseverance biases might stop him from properly responding to this new information. Now, under belief perseverance biases, we have these 5 biases that I've already mentioned a few times. And again, remember CC-RE: conservatism, confirmation, representativeness, illusion of control, and hindsight bias. So let's talk about conservatism bias now. With this bias, we tend to maintain prior views or forecasts by inadequately incorporating new information. So basically, we stick to our traditional views, or we stick to the views that we already have. This bias has aspects of statistical and information processing errors. And we say this because we already have certain views, and when new information comes in, basically we are not processing this new information very well. We are sticking to our traditional views or whatever views we already had. And that's why this is called conservatism, because conservatism is about sticking to traditional ways or sticking to the sorts of ideas that we've had previously. This bias causes individuals to overweight initial beliefs about probabilities and outcomes. And again, the point here is that people who have this bias will not properly apply the Bayes formula. So they will not update their views based on new information. What are the consequences of the conservative bias? One obvious consequence is that people with this bias will underreact to new information. People will also maintain or be slow to update a view or a forecast even when new information is available. People might opt to maintain a prior belief rather than deal with the mental stress of updating beliefs given complex data. And based on all this, those who have this bias are likely to hold a security longer than a rational decision maker. So if somebody believes that a given stock is good and has held on to the stock for a while, and new information comes in which clearly suggests that this particular stock is overpriced, then those who have a conservatism bias might just stick on or continue with that particular asset or stock, even though the information is suggesting otherwise. The next major question is, how do we overcome conservatism bias? The first step is to recognize that this bias exists. If we look around us, we can clearly see that conservatism bias manifests itself in many different ways. So if this bias exists around us, perhaps we ourselves have this bias. So we can ask some questions. How does this information, or if any new information come in, how does this change my forecasts? And related to that, what is the impact of this new information? If I am not adequately responding to new information, or I am ignoring new information, then perhaps I have this conservatism bias. We should also recognize that updating beliefs is inversely correlated with the effort involved. What that means is that if new information comes in and it's very difficult to process this new information, or there is a fair amount of effort that will go into changing my beliefs or changing my views or changing the probabilities that I have that are associated with how a given investment will perform, the more difficult this whole process, the more likely it is that I will not change my beliefs. But obviously, this doesn't make logical sense. Just because something is difficult doesn't mean it should not be done. So what should we do? What we should try and do is perform a careful analysis where we incorporate new information that comes in. And if this is difficult for us to do, then we should seek advice from experts. So these are some thoughts on what is meant by conservatism bias, what are the consequences, and then how do we try and overcome conservatism bias. The next belief perseverance bias is the confirmation bias. Here we look for and notice what confirms our existing beliefs. So this sounds a little bit like the conservatism bias, but the difference is that here we are trying to identify information and only focusing on information that confirms our existing beliefs, and we ignore information or ignore articles which go against our beliefs. So we think we are being more rational and more scientific by going after information, but the problem is that we are only going after information that confirms our beliefs, or we are only trying to use that information that confirms what we already believe. An example here is that, let's say you are a financial advisor or a portfolio manager, and a client comes to you, and the client insists on adding a stock and then points to research and articles which support his view. So he gives you these articles that support the view that this is a good stock, and completely ignores all the research and articles that suggest that other stocks might be a better option. So this would be an example where you are dealing with a client who is exhibiting confirmation bias. What are some consequences of this bias? One obvious consequence is that a person who has this bias will consider only positive information and ignore negative information about a particular investment. Another consequence is that if we develop screening criteria, so this is criteria based on which we select investments, and in developing this criteria, we ignore information that refutes the validity of the screening criteria. So we might come up with criteria, but if there is a problem with this criteria and there is information that suggests what's wrong with the screening criteria, we just ignore this other information. Because of this bias, we might end up with an under-diversified portfolio. In other words, there is not enough diversification, so there is more risk exposure than is needed. Another scenario is where someone might hold a disproportionate amount of investment assets in employing companies' stock. So very often companies might have employee stock option plans or employee stock purchase plans. And here, since a person is constantly hearing about how good his company is, that's what management would invariably be saying, then he is only going to look for information that confirms the view that this stock is good, and therefore might end up owning more of his company stock than makes sense for his overall portfolio. So how does one overcome the confirmation bias? One technique is to seek information which challenges our beliefs. So we should recognize that this bias exists. So we should consciously go out and look for views that challenge our beliefs, and then evaluate how good or how rational these other beliefs are. We should also get corroborating support from other sources. So let's say we are a financial analyst and we believe that a particular stock A is good, and we've done our research. And let's say we are evaluating in a certain way. We might go speak to other colleagues who also study the stock from a different perspective and see what view they have. So in essence, what we are trying to do is get other beliefs. So beliefs from people who might not be looking at this particular stock in the same way. They might be evaluating the stock based on other research, or they might have a different perspective. So we should try and understand what they are doing and make sure that we are not limiting ourselves to a small set of articles that only support the stock. So through these other people that we contact, we might also see research that suggests that other stocks or other options are better than this particular one. Moving on to representativeness bias. Somebody who suffers from this bias will classify new information based on past experiences and classifications. We can have two types of representativeness bias: base rate neglect and sample size neglect. In base rate neglect, the base rate or probability of the categorization is not adequately considered. For example, categorizing company ABC as a growth stock without appropriate due diligence would basically be representativeness bias. Financial market participants sometimes rely on stereotypes when making investment decisions without adequately incorporating the base probability of the stereotype occurring. So the classification of ABC is based on the financial market participants' stereotype about growth companies, but it ignores the base probability that the company may not be a growth company. For example, there might be a stereotype that if a company is a small company, then it should be classified as a growth stock. But this is just a stereotype. It is quite possible that a small company is not likely to grow. So a particular ABC small company might actually be small and stable rather than a growth company. So this would be an example of representativeness bias with base rate neglect. We are neglecting the probability that this stereotype is not always true. The other situation is sample size neglect. This is where financial market participants incorrectly assume that small sample sizes are representative of populations or real data. In the investment context, sample size neglect can be when a few data points are naively extrapolated as being representative of a long-term trend. For example, an investor might put too much emphasis on short-term results when considering a potential investment. So an investor might look at results from the last 2 quarters. So the investor sitting here, this is the last quarter, this is the quarter before that. Let's say that the numbers were good here. Based just on this very small sample size of the last 2 quarters of data, the investor assumes that this particular stock will do well in the future. This would be an example of sample size neglect. Essentially, what the investor is doing is taking this very small sample size and using it as representative of what this particular stock will do. What are the consequences of representativeness bias? One possible consequence is that somebody who suffers from this bias will adopt a view or forecast based almost exclusively on new information and or a small sample. So that's exactly what's happening over here. The investor has this new or recent information which is in his face. He sees this more easily and then makes decisions based on this representative data. Another possible consequence is where someone updates beliefs using simple classifications rather than deal with the mental stress of updating beliefs given more complex data. So this is the first example that I talked about, where it is easy for an investor to say that, okay, this is a small company, therefore it's a growth company. But in reality, what the investor should do is study this company in more detail and determine whether or not it actually is a growth company. The investor is avoiding this difficulty or this mental stress and just making a quick, rash judgment that this is a growth company. To some extent, representativeness bias is the opposite of conservatism bias. With conservatism bias, an investor sticks with his ideas and views from the past, doesn't let new information change his views very easily. Whereas with representativeness bias, new information is given too much importance, and then this new information might actually change decisions. So in both cases, information is not being processed very well, but the relative importance given to new information versus old or traditional information, the way they are dealt with is different between representativeness bias and conservatism bias. How do we overcome representativeness bias? One step is to be aware of statistical mistakes that we may be committing. So are we relying on too small a sample? Are we giving too much emphasis to a particular sort of category or a particular categorization that we have? Also, we should consider whether we are overlooking the reality of the investment situation. So this is a question that we should continuously be asking if we want to overcome representativeness bias. Next, we have the illusion of control bias. People with this bias incorrectly believe that they can control or influence outcomes. But the reality obviously is that they don't have as much control or influence as they think. And this also happens in life. Very often people believe, especially people in powerful positions, believe that they have more control or more influence than they actually do. So what are some of the consequences of this bias in the context of investing? One consequence is that a trader might trade more often than is prudent. So if we have a day trader who believes that he can control investment returns, such a trader will trade much more often than actually makes sense. This bias can also lead to inadequate diversification, especially for someone who is quite senior in a company and believes that he or she can control the future of the company. Such a person might end up investing more in that particular company than is justified or than what actually makes sense. How do we overcome this particular bias? One thing to do is to recognize that investing is a probabilistic activity. So investing is not a situation where you do X, Y, Z and you can be sure of a given result. There are so many variables and so many complex variables involved that the performance of a given investment is fairly probabilistic. So we aren't sure exactly what is going to happen. Also, we should recognize that global capitalism is complex, and even powerful investors have little control over outcomes. One of the most powerful companies in the world is AIG, and even AIG could not control what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. A third strategy is to seek contrary viewpoints, and this can help change the perception that I have a lot of control over a particular event. And then maintaining records is another good idea. When we maintain records of our transactions, we should also document the rationale behind each trade, the attributes that we have determined to be in favor of investment success. So we document why we are taking certain actions. And then over time, we will realize that areas where we thought we had control, we did not really have control. And this can be done by just looking at past data where things did not end up happening the way we expected them to happen. And if we have records of that, then it becomes easier to internalize and recognize the fact that we don't have as much control and influence as we think we do. Next, we have hindsight bias. People with this bias see past events as having been predictable and reasonable to expect. So let's say we are at this point in time and a certain event occurred. Let's say that the financial markets crashed. If we are looking back at this crash and saying that it was obvious, it was very predictable that this crash will happen, then we might be suffering from hindsight bias. Because before this crash happened, there were several very smart people who were not able to predict this crash. But after the event, when we look back and say it was obvious, then perhaps we are suffering from hindsight bias. Here is an excerpt from the curriculum. In hindsight, poorly reasoned decisions with positive results may be described as brilliant tactical moves, and poor results of well-reasoned decisions may be described as avoidable mistakes. So this statement really has two parts. One situation is where the result ended up being positive. So we invested in, let's say, stock 1, and we didn't really do a good analysis. We just thought that it might be a good investment. We saw others making this investment and we bought the stock, and it ended up doing very well. We didn't really do a proper analysis. Once the stock performed well, we look back and say that we performed a wonderful analysis and we were brilliant with respect to this decision. That would be an example of hindsight bias. So we are looking back, we are just seeing that the results were good and therefore concluding that this was a brilliant decision. Then let's say that there is stock 2 and an analyst did all the right research, he covered all bases and made this investment, but for some reason this investment performed poorly. Then in hindsight, somebody might say that this was an avoidable mistake. They'll find some reason for saying that we should never have bought this stock. even though all the right analysis was done. So this again would be an example of hindsight bias, where we look at the results which were negative in the case of stock 2, and using hindsight we say that this was a mistake, we should not have invested in stock 2. Now let's talk about the consequences of hindsight bias. One consequence is that financial market participants might overestimate the degree to which they predict past investment outcomes, and this will lead to false confidence. Often, financial market participants look back and selectively remember the decisions that they make. They might have made some good decisions and they tend to remember those good decisions and then feel unfairly confident and have this false confidence about their ability to make good investment decisions. Another consequence is to unfairly assess a money manager's performance. So you might have a particular money manager who focuses on value stocks, and in general, over the last few years, this money manager might have done a very good job. But it might turn out that last year this particular money manager did not do well because the overall market performed poorly. He might have done all the right analysis, covered his bases, and made some decisions that appeared very good at the time, but the market for value stocks, let's say, did not do well. In general, let's say value stocks came down and say other categories of stocks such as growth stocks did well. In hindsight, we might say that this money manager did not do well because we aren't looking at his work and his analysis. We are simply looking at the outcome, and the outcome might have been negative. So this would be a consequence of hindsight bias. How do we overcome this bias? The first thing to do is to recognize that this bias might exist. We should also be honest about what has happened in the past. So we should be honest about what we've done, the mistakes that we've made. So we should ask ourselves whether we are changing history, whether we are rewriting what happened in the past, or we are honestly assessing what happened in the past. We should also carefully record and examine investment decisions, both good and bad. So if all these decisions are carefully documented, then later on we can look at what happened. So for each decision, we can say what decision was made, what was the justification, what are the expectations, and then look at what happened. And when we look at our past record, that will over time help us overcome the hindsight bias.